I'm going to be diving into the somewhat risky topic of defining genres today. Now, genres are very subjective, so clearly some people are going to disagree with me. But I'm going to explain why I think certain genre titles don't apply in certain circumstances, and I'm going to explain my reasoning behind that. So there's two descriptors that tend to come up with regards to Dungeons and Dragons. There's fantasy adventure game and there's heroic fantasy game. Now, I am fully on board with calling pretty much every version of D&D a fantasy adventure game. It is fantasy. You have, fantastical races, elves, dwarves, dragons, creatures from beyond. These are fantasy elements. You have your magic, and the kinds of weird supernatural plot elements that always arise. Sure, it is a fantasy game. It is also an adventure game. So it is primarily designed to be about a group of adventurers who go out into the world exploring strange locations, meeting new people, defeating bad guys, going on an adventure. So it is a fantasy adventure game. I have no beef with that. Pretty much all versions of D&D are fantasy adventure games. But the other descriptor is the heroic fantasy. Now, I would take issue with calling 5th edition a heroic fantasy for the reason that I consider the heroic part of that genre to be largely about the relationship between characters and danger. So how do 5th edition characters handle danger? Now, this is not to say that all tables and all campaigns handle this in the same way. But I'm going to talk about the way that the game mechanically encourages characters to behave. Now, if you're in a more casual campaign where the difficulty is not cranked up, this is not necessary for you. And you can kind of handle it however you want. You can go be heroic. But I'm talking about what the game itself encourages with its mechanics. 5th edition characters are encouraged to avoid risk. You want to, proceed very carefully down the hallway, check for traps. You want to, whenever you're doing something, you kind of want to be as far away from it as possible, because anything dangerous tends to be in an area around it. And so if you are outside that area, you are not at risk. How do you defeat really hard encounters? You put down area control effects to stop the enemy from getting to you, to remove actions from them so that they cannot hurt you. Just avoid being attacked, hit them from afar, if at all possible, kite them away, run away, shoot. These kinds of tactics are certainly sound. They're tactically viable, and certainly something that you would do in real life. But they're not really what you would call heroic, is it? When you think of a heroic character, you tend to think of people who sort of kick down the door, run in, guns a-blazing, heavy metal music blaring in the background, the fighter that is not afraid to get in a tangle with as many monsters as happens to be there, as opposed to what is mechanically encouraged in 5th edition. Now, once again, I want to emphasize, not every table does this, and not every table needs to do this. Not every table should do this. The lower the difficulty, the more you can get away with. And so in casual campaigns and in a lot of adventure modules, it's fully unnecessary. But if you crank the difficulty way up and you start to sort of refine what characters should do in order to overcome the challenges presented to them, you start to pare away these methods of play that aren't as efficient, that aren't as effective, that aren't as potent. And you start to realize that the way that characters should, in super bold quotes, behave is kind of not cowardly. That's not the right word, but it is certainly they should avoid all risks. And I've noticed that this, as a player tendency, has actually spilled over into other games. When I run Blades in the Dark with players who have only played D&D, I notice that they are extremely risk averse in a system that really encourages you to take risks. It mechanically supports people doing like foolish things. And that's like baked into the system at several levels. In D&D, you really shouldn't do things that incur unnecessary risk. Pretty much under any circumstances. Minimize risk at all times. That is the way that it is in 5th edition and in 3rd edition. 4th edition, less so, because you have characters that can reliably take the punishment of kicking down the door, running in, taking on the hordes. You have your defender standing fast against the horde of enemies and being pretty confident he's going to come out on top. Even your ranged attackers aren't like ducking around a corner to shoot. They are stepping out, they're doing their tactical maneuvering, they're running around the enemy, and they're like getting into position and really mixing it up. And you have a lot more dynamic scenes and combats this way. And it feels more heroic, The fact that everyone can kind of like get in and tangle with the enemy. And the enemies themselves also are more heroic because they have special abilities. They're not just bags of hit points that are going to run forward and auto attack you as often as they can until they die. You have enemies that like they get more powerful as they take damage. When this creature gets bloodied, it recharges a special ability and can use it immediately. That's dragons in 4th edition. Their breath weapons recharge as soon as they get to half health, and they use them immediately. And that's really scary. You've got all these mechanics to like make the scene more dynamic and more cinematic, and as a result, the player characters that deal with those challenges, they feel more heroic. And that is why I think 4th edition qualifies as heroic fantasy and 5th edition does not. Because the types of behaviors that the two systems encourage with their mechanics. Because mechanics do incentivize certain behaviors. This is always going to be true. And while you can ignore those incentives and do your own thing, you're always allowed to do that. It is a role-playing game, and in my opinion, player agency is like one of the most sacrosanct parts of playing a role-playing game. So you can certainly do things that aren't optimal, but that doesn't change the fact that the game kind of encourages and expects you to behave in certain ways. And when the difficulty goes up, if you want to succeed, you're going to have to more and more align your behavior with that expectation if you want to come out on top. So all versions of D&D are fantasy adventure games, but they're not all heroic fantasy. And so that's why I think that I haven't really enjoyed 5th edition for its entire run. And I've only just recently sort of like come to articulate this. The fact that I'm looking for a heroic fantasy game. And that's not what it is. And I don't think it ever can be. And that's why I play 4th edition.